Welcome back to Modern Education. I'm your host, Ben Woodford, here in the studio with my guest, Ben Domingue. He's a professor in the Stanford Graduate School of Education since 2015. Ben has earned a BS and an MA from University of Texas, Austin in mathematics and a PhD in education from the University of Colorado Boulder. He's also spent some time in a classroom as a teacher. Professor Domingue currently studies how student outcomes can be leveraged to inform student learning, teacher performance, and program efficacy. He's also published papers on the topic of genetic data analysis and the relationships DNA can inform related to academic attainment. I'm going to bring him on the line here and say hello. Thanks for coming in the studio today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been really looking forward to this. So before we jump into, your expertise and where you're at now, I'd really love to give the audience just a little bit of background, kind of how you got here, how you became focused and interested in education and assessment.
So I have kind of a fun story on that point.
Yeah.
I was in my mid-20s. I didn't exactly know what to do with life. And so the one thing that I had always been good at was going to school. So I started to do this master's in math. And when I was doing the master's, I started to take courses from this guy, Yuri Treisman, who was in the math department, but primarily did education policy analysis. And I had never previously been exposed to the needs of, kind of quantitative thinking and quantitative rigor in the social sciences. And so that got me thinking about possibilities in that domain. And then right as I was graduating from the master's program, I saw there was this article on the front page of the New York Times about the need for psychometricians in the wake of the No Child Left Behind Act. So No Child Left Behind really expanded the testing industry and the need for testing professionals in the U.S. For better or worse, that's something we can talk about later, but there certainly was a huge demand. And so I saw that and I said, I have an idea as far as a career.
Right.
And so I taught for a year after my master's, but during that year I applied for PhD programs in psychometrics. And I guess I should say what that is. So psychometrics is the kind of study of psychological measurement. So this can be anything from, how do you measure personality, or how do you measure cognitive decline in the elderly? For young people, it's, at least in the U.S. these days, it's primarily standardized testing, that kind of endeavor. So then I left the classroom and went and did a PhD in psychometrics.
So you kind of knew where you were heading, even though you took this time to apply to programs and to get into a classroom and maybe get some perspective on classroom discourse and things like that, but you knew where you were headed.
Yeah, there was not a long time in the classroom that I didn't know that I wasn't going to leave and go back to do a PhD.
Right,
I think that's
right. And so, I'm interested, I always like these stories about how you met somebody and this professor sort of guided you into a direction that you didn't know about or didn't see coming. Is there any way how he got through to you, or what happened there that it hooked you?
I don't think it was anything about Yuri was a wonderful professor and advisor, but I think the reality was that I was just completely unaware of I had always been in a math department. The way I kind of caricature it is that the mathematicians, the less it had to do with reality or the human experience, the higher prestige it was.
Right.
And I just had no clue, the degree to which quantification and kind of mathematical thinking and those types of things were really important to kind of modern social science. So that was just a totally new thing to me. So when I got in his class and started hearing about how, one could use various tools and techniques to study the efficacy of programs and those types of things, my mind was blown. I just had no idea that existed previously.
Yeah, that's really cool. I have a similar perspective with my undergrad in pure mathematics. It's like the higher, more theoretical it becomes, the more respected it is in the field.
Exactly.
So do you feel like you have strayed from your roots into the more like
no
practical,
doubt.
useful math?
I am very much, now I am down very far from the heights of mathematical abstraction, dealing with very applied problems and messy data and the like. Right.
And how does that feel? I mean, I think I'm curious about this as a math educator and thinking about how students perceive math and understand where they fit into all of that. Does it feel like you're still doing the math that is valuable, or should it be, or do you think that this hierarchy exists for a reason?
It's pretty clear to me. It became apparent to me as I started doing some graduate school in math that I was only going to go so far in that world. I just it was presumably some combination of kind of aptitude and interest. I was just uninterested in thinking about these utterly abstract problems as long as my peers, and probably couldn't think about them with the same level of insight anyways. But yeah, at some point I just knew that, whether it was high or low status, I didn't want to do that kind of math.
Right.
I didn't want to, use my brain in that way. It was not interesting to me.
Right. Yeah. And that's really a great thing, because if everybody was doing pure mathematics,
yeah, exactly,
we'd have a whole bunch of useless conclusions.
Yeah, we would have a lot of number theory
that
was not especially germane to the day-to-day lives that people live.
Anyway, so I really respect what you're doing. I think putting the rubber to the road, so to speak, is a great place to be. So I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you took the path you did.
Exactly.
I'm sure that our listeners will be too. So let's jump into just giving some context to the audience about understanding high-stakes testing and the idea of applying a high-stakes test to an entire population versus what is it like to sample a population to try to draw inferences. Can we just kind of lay that out for people?
Sure. So can I ask you a few questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
So can you give me an example of what you would mean by a high-stakes test?
Tests that have impact on classrooms or funding, things of that nature,
so
or being able to hold students back.
Yes. Okay. I asked because I think there's this common mistake in the way people talk about tests. Most of the tests that students in K-12 schools take, most of the large-scale standardized tests are not actually high stakes for the students. Mm-hmm. They may be in some settings. They may be high stakes for the teachers or the schools. But I do think it's important to differentiate between a measure that is high stakes for the individual versus one that might be high stakes for some other entity.
Right.
Something like the SAT or the ACT or the GRE, those are, I think, more kind of typical examples of measures that are high stakes for the individual,
because the student has real outcomes affected by what happens in the test.
Yeah,
right?
they bear the weight of that particular outcome. So let's start with maybe the K-12 kind of standardized testing type thing. So let's see. So in the U.S. At this point, the laws have changed a little bit over the years. I'm most familiar with what the laws were during the No Child Left Behind era, and at that point, kids effectively had to be tested from grades 3 to 8 in math and reading, and then once again in high school. Mm-hmm. And so, so there's obviously just tons of stuff we could talk about here. Well, so one question would be why standardization. One question would be like, what do we know about these measures? Why do we think this is a reasonable thing to do? One question would be, are these things fair?
Right.
What do you think would be of most interest?
Well, what I'm really curious about is just, testing 3 through 8. What is the purpose of that, and why do we do it? So, as opposed to testing in 3rd, 5th, and 8th.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so that's
random sampling of students across the country to try to establish a sort of baseline for the country versus a specific school or classroom.
That's a great question. So, we do, in fact, as a nation, do a large-scale kind of sample-based approach to testing.
Okay.
This is the NAEP, I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's commonly known as the Nation's Report Card. And so the NAEP tests students in, I think, 3rd, 5th, and 7th, and it's only a sample of students from around the nation. And using that, we can kind of make rough inferences about the different states in the union and the like. But that's a very different endeavor than the kind of standardized test that almost every student in grades 3 through 8 will take at the end of their school year.
Right.
And the reason I think that was given at the time for why we wanted to make every student take a test was, literally to leave no child behind. There's a complicated political history there. I don't want to pretend like I know all of it, but I do think a real benefit to that endeavor was that it became impossible for schools and school districts really had to account for all of their students, and it really did put a premium on making sure that students in different groups were actually kind of staying on, were meeting kind of reasonable levels of performance. So one of the things that No Child Left Behind did is it mandated disaggregated reporting. So, schools and districts had to break out test scores as a function of a race, for example. And that, it became quite useful to be able to see how different kinds of students did in different schools. And you really could, you could tell if students at a certain school were being kind of manifestly disserved by, or were just manifestly underperforming at a certain school. And I think that was potentially a quite valuable idea. I mean, again, it has a complicated history and legacy, but I think that attempt to, really make schools and districts account for all of the students placed in their care was, at least in the abstract, I think that's not an unreasonable thing.
Okay, so I think this is great because we're kind of breaking down maybe some of the misconceptions. I think a lot of people have a very negative, wholehearted blanket view of testing. Mm-hmm. And what you're saying is there is some real benefit to the data that comes from being able to get this more fine-grained, very detailed, and able to be separated into different categories. That data is useful to you as a researcher who's looking at it.
I think so. I mean, I don't, absent that data, it becomes very challenging to go to a school within a district and say, you are not serving your students well. Like, what are the outcomes at which you point to make that kind of claim? I mean, I understand that standardized testing is very much sausage making. The details I think can be both tedious and ugly at times, but I don't know how one gets away entirely from attempts to understand what students know and can do. That just seems like such a basic question we would have about, this massive industry that is education. And I just don't know why you'd want to move away from that entirely.
Right. So, yeah, and that is, I think, exactly what I was hoping to be able to help us see, is that there is real value in this, right? And especially, as you said, there's such a huge amount of money and infrastructure and support for the industry as a whole. If we're not measuring it, we'd be kind of just throwing money into a hole and hoping for the best.
I concur. And, I think it helps a little bit sometimes, especially for people that are very passionate about education, to maybe put education to the side for a moment and think about, medicine or law enforcement. If you looked at some of these other industries and the people from those industries told you, we're not going to try to measure outcomes, and we're just going to basically trust in goodwill to assure that all is well, that would not fly.
Right.
And to my mind, education is kind of the same. It's not that, the goal to me is not to penalize anybody. It's to understand what's going on, understand who needs help, understand who's doing well and can potentially be learned from. It's not about finding a way to use the stick. I'm all about the carrots, I guess.
Right.
But it doesn't seem crazy to me to try to figure out what an 8-year-old knows about mathematics in some kind of systematic way. And
right.
I do think that systematic component is important. I think, testing is an endeavor that once you attempt to start doing it, it becomes very complicated very quickly, mm-hmm. especially if you want to do it in a way that's, fair and can be done at scale. And that complexity is I think it can be off-putting to people, but it's largely an attempt to make sure that there's a relatively level playing field when the measurement is done. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that being aware of some of the rationales for the complexity and some of the things that have been done to ensure that the measures are as fair as we can make them, or at least, that's the goal.
Right.
I think those are important messages to get to a broader group, because it's, if you meet people at states and testing companies, these are not evil people. These are people
right.
that legitimately want to help students improve education. And it certainly is the case that there are times and places where educational measurement has not been used to those ends, and
right.
where it's kind of been done sloppily. But I think in general, there's a lot of goodwill behind the attempt to do it, and it's just a legitimately hard thing to do.
Yeah. And I'm kind of sensing within what you're talking about that there's maybe a disconnect between the political agendas for testing versus the research agendas.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think oftentimes, why policymakers may be interested in testing and why educators or education researchers may be interested. Those might be two very different things.
Right.
But I think that if you measure something, I don't want to pretend that always lacks any kind of context. Sometimes you know why you're measuring things, but I don't think just the attempt to measure something is not in and of itself, I think, an especially malevolent thing to do. I think what one does with the measures, that's an important question that one has to grapple with, I think, even when they're building the measure. But how policymakers end up using measures that's a complicated thing, and it's hard to know. As somebody who thinks about measurement, it's hard to know how to account for that, because I don't control the policymakers.
Right. You can put out the perfect measurement, and then it's used in a weird way, and it's almost out of your hands once you've built it at some level.
Absolutely. Even I would say, as another example for where the attempt to do something perfectly went awry in my own personal experience. I worked for a number of years in Colombia, trying to help them think through a system for evaluating their higher ed sector. As in the U.S., they have a kind of very heterogeneous higher ed sector, including a lot of for-profit colleges and universities, and they wanted to figure out some way to provide information to the students of these institutions about the kind of education those schools were providing on average. And this seemed to me like a laudable thing to do, especially at the higher ed level, where you really do have kind of autonomous agents spending their own money in general. And we worked on this for a number of years, and by the time we finally kind of almost had something ready to go, the political situation changed and nobody was interested in the project anymore. And so we kind of let the perfect be the enemy of the good, I think, on that one. So I guess the punchline there is that, sometimes you might kind of shake your fist at the policymakers, and sometimes the researchers are also part of the problem. I just think, in general, policy is hard, and it's going to take, sometimes many attempts before we get it right. But that's I don't know what the kind of alternative would be, Like, it just seems to me like some of these things are challenges that we have to keep on trying it.
Yeah, it seems to me that just connecting researchers and policymakers at an earlier stage could be a huge piece of that, just seeing how things developed so they have a clear understanding of what they're doing with those numbers that they receive at the end. But
I think, I like that idea a lot. I mean, I do think, putting policymakers in closer contact to researchers, that could definitely play dividends.
I mean, it kind of reminds me of the marketing and product development dichotomy, right? If you're marketing, you need to know your product, and if you're building a product, you need to know how it's going to be marketed, and those things work together all the way up.
I agree.
So it kind of seems like a similar parallel. But let's move on. Okay, so we got some tons. I got too many questions for this hour. Right. So, could we have a sampling strategy for testing that would be more conducive to be able to get the information we need, but still be able to give us that more fine-grained look, so there wouldn't be as much of a temptation to use the data towards specific sort of agendas?
I think that last bit's hard. It's interesting that you asked that question. I actually, along with a few grad students a few years ago, wrote a paper very much along these lines, where we were basically asking the question about whether you could, say, for example, not test students every year and still get information from which you could make inferences about, maybe their schools or teachers. Yeah. And, what that taught me was that we probably could do way more with less in the way of testing. So I think we get a lot of the information that we want and need from tests with a less invasive kind of testing regimen. Right. I think that's a possibility. I do think there are other challenges. It would be difficult to really do like a random sampling of students at a school, right, and have that work, given the scandals that we've seen in many places. When we test every student, I think it'd be very natural to expect a lot of unethical behavior around this new kind of way of gaming things. I can see like systematic missingness being entered in.
Right, sort of manipulating that process to get higher scores.
That's not to say we shouldn't do it, but I do think it would be a new avenue for problems that we would have to address.
So it's not something that could be cookie cutter implemented. It would really have to be deliberately thought through and sort of rethought.
I think that's right. I think it would have to be done with great care. I mean, I can definitely appreciate the need for a reduced testing burden on the students. I think that would be a potentially laudable thing to try to work out. One way that I've thought a lot about that is that I think from my perspective, one of the most interesting things happening right now is that we've spent, over a century at this point, pretty much dialing in our capacity to take a bunch of students, put them in a room, ask them a bunch of questions, and kind of rank order them. Mm-hmm. Whatever the benefits of that activity are, we can agree or disagree, but we've spent about a century working out all the kind of technical details.
You're talking about kind of placing students along a bell curve and being able to say who's at the top, who's at the bottom, who fits the middle.
Exactly.
Sort of. Okay.
And, I think what we're dealing with now is a suddenly very new situation where we're not dealing with a kind of static moment in time, but we're dealing with a dynamic situation where we can effectively, in a lot of cases, just be continuously observing what students are knowing and can do.
Are you talking about through like computer interfaces?
Yeah, exactly.
Things like that?
I mean, we can, I'm in a lot of schools and districts, there's already the capacity to kind of collect data on the students all year. Mm-hmm. And so, you can imagine a scenario in which we no longer need to take a kind of snapshot about where a student is at one exact moment in time. We'll just maybe kind of start to think about how we can use their performance on a variety of items over the entire year to make some inference about how they're doing. And that, that to me could start to be both less invasive in terms of being, it's not like we're losing a whole week to testing anymore. We're just using much stuff that's already collected in the kind of typical school day, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I think that could be a potentially useful way of reducing the testing burden and getting new information that is really useful in terms of understanding what students know and can do.
Yeah, that sounds like a really different approach because it makes the data useful in real time, right? It gives teachers the ability to react and reapproach the students' needs instead of end of the year, we send a report off to the state and the teacher never gets to actually use the information themselves or has no meaningful way to even do that, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So in educational measurement, there's this classic distinction made between formative and summative assessment. Right. So in summative assessment, this is where you kind of at the end of some process make a summative judgment about where a student is, how much they...
And so that's the end of the year approach.
Exactly.
Right.
And the formative approach is more a kind of classroom assessment type idea where you see what a kid is doing now and then you ask, okay, well, how do I get them doing the thing they're not doing? How do I actually educate them? And one could imagine, given that we now have the capacity for dynamic data collection, I think we could potentially do way more on this formative assessment side.
Do you think the testing bodies and the sort of the government-funded testing machine should be taking that mantle up more? Do you know if there's a movement towards that, or?
I don't know. I think that one's. I think so. First of all, I think there are a lot of reasons that you couldn't kind of just move it wholesale to that approach at present. A lot of classrooms don't have computers. The items that are used in a lot of these settings may be suboptimal. Any item that you've interacted with on the SAT or on a state accountability exam, that item has been through the ringer typically in terms of ensuring that it's, grade appropriate, that it is, at least to the best of our ability, kind of performs comparably in different groups of students, et cetera, et cetera. The items that you encounter, in some kind of less well-vetted system, they have unknown properties. And so that might be another reason we couldn't go to that kind of system as of yet. Right. So I think over the long haul, it could well be that we could, take some of our investment out of the once a year kind of testing approach that we're currently using, but we're going to have to work our way up to that. And I think a lot of work needs to be done on both the kind of the the quantitative methods that underlie our dynamic measurement approaches, the quality of the systems that are used to generate that data. We're going to have to administer it to a larger set of students in more standardized way. I mean, there are problems that if we wanted to take this really seriously that we're going to have to overcome. But I do think that technology could certainly be a game changer in that respect.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of one of those things where we have to make that a priority if it's ever going to happen, right? And so it kind of, when does it become a priority and when do we start to shift? Or we already have, like you said, 100 years in this approach that we've been using. And it seems like it actually gives some very useful data. So why completely rethink it, right?
Yeah. So I think that's right. I mean, and I also think that there are a new set of players, groups like Khan Academy and outfits like that are collecting, huge amounts of data about what students can know and do in very different ways and in different settings. And they might have insights that kind of revolutionize how we think through this as well. So I look forward to seeing what the future holds on this front. I think, there's going to be a lot of challenges to doing it in an efficacious way. I don't know that I'm optimistic or pessimistic at this point, but whether it happens, I just think it's at least an opportunity that from a research perspective, I think there's tons to do there.
Plenty of curiosity,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I know we actually did talk about this a little bit, but I want to be very explicit about it. What would be the problems or the drawbacks of if, say, this opt-out thing became really mainstream? What kind of problems or what would that be? Is it possible that could be a good thing for the country if people widely started opting out, or would that maybe create more problems than it would solve? Or what's your thoughts on that?
So I guess the area of the problem that I would feel most kind of equipped to speak to would be, what would happen to the kinds of indicators that we build from student standardized tests. And so, to the extent that we use student test scores to at least in part understand teacher effectiveness, if you start to have very systematic missingness in who is and who is not taking the test, that's going to, really start to impact our understanding of teacher performance. Okay. So, if let's say, for example, that every student in grade 4 who is over the 90th percentile in performance that year is opting out, right? So,
so we're talking the top 10%.
The top 10%, those are the kids whose parents say, nope, we're not doing that.
Right.
If you're a teacher and you have one student who started the year and last year they were at the 20th percentile of performance, and you only had one other student and they started the year at the 25th percentile of performance, and both of those kids went up, they moved up, say, 10 percentile performance units over the course of that year. Okay. We would be able to observe that. Right. If, on the other hand, I'm a teacher and I have 2 students as well, and one of my students started at the 50th percentile in grade 3, and in grade 4 was also at the 50th percentile. And then I had another student that started at the 75th percentile and moved up to the 95th percentile in grade 4, right? So you had 2 students, each of which went up 10 percentile points. I have one student that didn't move at all, one student that went up 20, but because they're now at the 95th percentile in grade 4, I don't see them.
It's missing entirely.
Right. We would think that, basically that I was a much less effective teacher than you because the only student for whom we observe information in my class didn't move in the kind of relative rank distribution, whereas the students we observed in yours did, and they moved up. And so that kind of systematic missingness would really bias our understanding about our relative levels of effectiveness. Right. So I do think that, the opt-out movement, to the extent that it's really non-random, it is a problem for these kinds of systems. Okay. Whether or not it's ultimately a good thing or a bad thing, that's just a much harder question. Right.
So it definitely does something as far as throwing a wrench in the mix for figuring out what's happening.
Yeah. So it depends on the state and the district, but in a lot of places, teacher, every year a teacher is going to get some kind of performance evaluation, and part of that performance evaluation might be based on how their students did on this year's test relative to last year's test. And if we, just are observing a very biased, a kind of skewed set of students, a non-representative set of students for a teacher, that we're going to misunderstand their performance this year, and that that's clearly a problem that we need to address.
Yeah, and that's definitely a problem on the research side, and maybe a little less clear how it's a problem on the actual teacher or student side, right? Because they may not care if they're having their evaluation based on the data, or the students may not really know or even understand.
Individual students, may not be affected by this,
Right.
but I think like if I was a district administrator, this would be of concern to me if my district used student test scores in teacher evaluations. That would be a real problem.
Right. So, yeah, and I think I'm just trying to put something out there for parents here. Maybe thinking about opting out isn't something we should just do right away because we heard about it and it sounds like a good idea. We should just take the time to listen to shows like this and to get a little more information and really figure out what the impact or the repercussions are of making a choice like that.
Well, I guess what I would say is that, the kind of one of the core ingredients to building a measure that is, I'm trying to define what I mean without using the key word because I don't want to give the key word. But basically, one of the most important properties to building a measure is to make sure that it has validity. And one of the key components of validity has to do with how the measure is used. At least that's, in the definition given by AERA and CME and the APA. These are three professional agencies for education researchers, measurement professionals, and psychologists. And so this is something that these professional organizations, have put their weight behind. And so what I would say is parents should feel entitled to ask, how are these measures being used? And if they're not being used in high stakes ways for your child, and they're being used only to kind of, make some inferences about schools and teachers, you may have feelings about that, but you should know that. You should know how the measure is being used. I think that's something you should feel entitled to ask for.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense just from the standpoint of being a well-informed consumer, right? We are consumers of education. We are all somehow connected to that system. So I think that's such a great just place to take your questions, right? What is this for? What is it being used for? How is it being used behind the scenes, so to speak, right?
Exactly.
And it's a nice way to help direct becoming more informed. So I have another question. This is kind of jumping around a little bit here, but thinking about testing and timing, right? Is there anything useful or meaningful as far as data goes for timing a test? Say sitting down to take a test and you have an hour to complete it, or 3 hours or whatever. Are there drawbacks or reasons why we should or shouldn't do that?
So why a time limit would be imposed on a test?
Right.
Okay, so that's a great question. So the complicated. Let me give you the kind of
please
the
give us some
summary
background.
as I see it. So most tests are designed such that they are not speeded. The basic idea is that a kind of test taker should not have problems with the length of time that we give them to take the test. We impose time limits on tests, partially so people just don't try to spend forever on them, right? This is partially just for their own well-being.
Yeah.
So as a function of the test design, the time limit should not typically be a problem for most test takers.
Okay.
And then there are accommodations, given frequently for test takers for whom there are extra considerations that need to be accounted for. So, I do think in general people think of, time test, and certainly there are some, but just in general, the idea behind testing design is aims to create psychological measures that aren't, purely a function of how quickly you're able to do things. That may be appropriate in some aspects. So I'm giving a driving test, right? And it takes you 25 seconds to respond from seeing the oncoming car to like jerking the wheel. That would be a real problem.
Right.
Their
it's a
time
meaningful place to impose a time.
Exactly.
Right?
But measurement professionals try to think through the relevance of time, and to the extent that time is not a kind of mission critical type thing. Tests are meant to be not speeded is the word that would be used, and so they're meant to be. The time limit is not something that should be of great importance for most test takers.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to push back on that a little bit because I've actually done some tutoring with the groups of students for SAT and things like that. And we've looked at how many questions there are in the test and how much time they have. And we came to a conclusion, basically, every question should be answered within a minute. And then the really hard ones, you'll have a little extra time that way. And the easy ones, maybe you can get done quicker. But there is definitely a game to trying to even pace yourself to be able to use that time effectively. effectively. And I know there's been some changes recently, and they're thinking about removing some of those constraints.
Yeah.
But it does seem like it enters into a place where you're putting new, almost, games on top of the actual assessment, where people need to practice with a timer, and they need to, assess the difficulty of a question, how much time they can put into it. Is that intentional, or is that just sort of a byproduct?
So I should caveat things by saying that I feel a little less comfortable speaking about the SAT. That's a slightly more exotic instrument.
Yeah.
So my remarks about the speediness of tests, I think, are mostly right when it comes to kind of the types of things we give to students in K through 10.
Okay. So this would be high stakes on the school side, not on the student side.
Yes, exactly. If I'm just giving a fifth grader a measure of their kind of reading comprehension, those things are typically, as I understand it, designed to be not speeded. It's not to say that's true in all cases, but the SAT is a more exotic instrument that has a long history. So yes, I think you might be quite right there that things, that speed does have a higher premium with respect to that particular test.
Okay. So there's maybe kind of both sides of the argument are valid in different contexts.
Exactly.
There's some tests that give plenty of time, and it shouldn't really even be a concern, and that's not even the point. Mm-hmm. And it's maybe more for our sanity. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then on the other side of it, there are probably some like GRE and things like that, where you have a very specific amount of time, and it's very high stakes for the person taking it. And that's a little bit different of a situation.
Yes. And one thing I would also note for the inquisitive listener, that almost any psychological measure that you encounter that is in widespread use is going to have some kind of technical report that underlies it, in which they'll tend to describe the way they've conceptualized the test with respect to these types of things. So they will, typically tell you, for example, they might say that, the test is not speeded, and here's the evidence we have on that. Or at least that would be best practice. Maybe they don't offer evidence on that. That would be a good thing to know. But I would encourage people that have real questions about certain measures to try to dig up the technical report that it's basically it explains the process used to construct the measure and has a lot of fascinating information.
Yeah.
You may not be satisfied with what they did or how they did it,
right?
But there should be something out there.
So those are available to people. Say if a parent wanted to understand a little more than just how is this being used.
Yeah. So if you have a kid in the California schools and they take the kind of state accountability exam at the end of the year, there's a ample technical documentation that's publicly available that you could look at if you were a parent. And certainly would contain information about things like this. It would contain information about the evidence about the fairness of the test, for example. Lots of these types of issues are covered.
And is it your opinion that these are digestible for your average reader, or is this a very technical document that would need translating or really a lot of time to get into understanding what it's saying?
They vary. Vary. I mean, I don't want to say that they're always the most appealing thing to dig into as a reader.
I'm sure maybe for very few people, except maybe you, they're really helpful for you. But
yeah, I mean, but if you're a parent and you have a question about the California assessment and you take a look at that thing and you can't figure out the answer, shoot me an email. I think this is important information for the measurement community to be able to relay to the public. I would encourage parents to look, and if they can't figure it out based on that look, then to ask.
Yeah, and that's great advice in a lot of cases. I think a lot of parents have the best intentions and want to help their kids as much as possible, but they sort of don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully we're giving a few tidbits, at least where to start. Yeah. And it's always so powerful to just ask, right? It can be so easy to just get overlooked or move on or let it go.
Exactly.
And taking that time to try to understand the thing it is that you're wanting your kid to be a part of or not be a part of, and really taking the time to find out who can help you understand it is huge.
Exactly.
So that's great advice in so many different areas, not just testing. In fact, maybe more in a lot of areas than testing. But okay, so I wanted to talk to you about, so we were talking about timing, right? And how, like, say, especially in younger grades, it's really not about the timing of the test. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it seems to me like there may be a sort of tail wagging the dog situation where the tests have a time, and even if the time is not intended to be restrictive for students, you end up having things where students are sitting in class doing times tables on a minute timer and just sort of driving themselves crazy. And I'm wondering if it seems like to me that those two things are connected, right? What we value is a test and the outcomes, and there's a timer there. So then the teachers make almost a legitimate argument that I should be timing everything they do because that's how it's done when they get to the important stuff. Would you have any comments on that or anything to say to answer that?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. So, this problem wherein we attempt to measure something, and the people that are held accountable to that measure then attempt to manipulate it is kind of a widespread one.
Yeah.
In kind of social science in general, this is known as Campbell's Law, and I'm not going to try to quote it, but the idea is basically that, once you kind of put a high stakes measure in place, you can be sure that you will have people trying to, mess with it in ways that are not
right.
Not
once they know how they're judged, then they're going to try to maximize their output.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, this has taken a number of stakes. In several cities, there have been large-scale testing scandals wherein teachers and administrators have been taking test booklets and in mass, erasing wrong answers and putting in correct ones. That's one type of kind of gamesmanship that has been observed.
Right.
A kind of more subtle form is when teachers maybe spend inappropriate amounts of time on things that they think are emphasized on the test. So very specific problem formats would be one example. That's, I would say less nefarious, but still potentially concerning. And so how to fix that? I think that's a very hard problem. One approach to understanding it, at least, has been advocated for by Dan Koretz at Harvard and other people, and he essentially has used audit tests and items to show that basically on tests that you have not emphasized, you may not see the same gains in student achievement as on the test that you have emphasized, and so this suggests that those gains are probably largely due to inappropriate forms of preparation or the like. So this idea of audit items is one way of potentially understanding it. Okay. In terms of fixing it, I think this is just a genuinely hard problem that we have to grapple with across a large variety of human endeavors. One solution that I've seen, I've always found this fascinating, comes from Derek Neal, who's an economist at Chicago. And he basically suggested, if I can paraphrase this correctly, is that you effectively don't tell people what's on the test. At present, we for a variety of reasons give the public a lot of information on what's on the test. It's going to be, this percentage of geometry items, this percentage of probability items. We offer that kind of information so that people know what's coming. This idea that, you just effectively don't give that kind of information in an attempt to keep people from behaving scandalously with it, I find fascinating. I have never been able to figure out if I think it's a good or bad idea, but it's at least one potential solution. I think just in general, so the two things I would close with on this point is that, A, this is not a problem unique to education. You can find example of Campbell's Law in effect in a whole number of fields, in medicine and law enforcement. This is just a generic problem. And B, that, this is unlikely to me to be solved by some kind of bureaucratic solution or trick. I think this is something that we'll just have to kind of deal with in an ongoing fashion.
Yeah. And that's probably the only answer that you could give that's going to be meaningful, right? So I want to switch a little bit here, thinking about scrutiny for teacher performance, right? So tests are used for that pretty blatantly or transparently for lower grades, elementary, middle, high, right? Why is that? Is that done in college, or if not, why?
That's a great question. So I would say in general, it's not. The endeavor that I was associated with in Columbia was truly unique, and that uniqueness was in part due to the fact that Columbia is, I think, one of only two nations in the world that has any kind of standard measure given at the end of higher education. Okay. We just don't, as a general rule, do anything at the end of higher education to understand what has transpired in those 3 or 4, 5 years that people have been at the school. So I think, there is very little that has been done over the years to kind of systematically understand how much learning happens in higher education, how much it varies across schools. You're starting to see changes in the U.S. There are a few companies that have measures meant to be given to students at the end of post-secondary school, and these are interesting and have given us some information about what goes on in college in terms of student learning. My colleague Prashant Loyalka is also doing fascinating work with a variety of countries from around the world. The last thing I saw from him was China, Russia, India, and the U.S. And he was looking at, say, for example, computer science and how much students that study computer science in those different countries learn over the course of higher ed. And he's able to, with a massive amount of data and a huge amount of legwork, I think offer really persuasive evidence about what's going on in that field. So I think there's activity and movement on this front, but it is definitely an underdeveloped area of research in general.
Yeah. Is that maybe like a historical relic where we just trusted our professors and the higher education was such a lofty thing in the first place that we just didn't question what they were doing, and it's just kind of stuck around that way? Is that kind of...
I think the professoriate is just a higher status profession, and so it's allowed to kind of self-regulate in a way that's more akin to what happens with doctors and lawyers, whereas with teachers, that is a lower status occupation that is, at least in the U.S., as kind of typically practiced, seen to need kind of outside observation and scrutiny to get maximum performance. I'm not saying I agree with that.
Oh, sure.
I think that's like the effectively
observing
what
the
is
reality.
happening.
Yeah. And this dynamic to me is really interesting because when I look at the grade school teachers, they go through teacher training and they go through mentorship programs and they go through certification and they go through, a whole slew of checkups for years afterwards.
As a college professor, I can tell you we don't have
none
any
of that.
that.
Oh, yeah, I know, right? No, nothing against you, but so I mean, as a data person, right, is this something that bothers you from the standpoint of like what's happening here and why are we putting so much data behind something that is presumably well regulated and prepared for, where on the presumably the culminating effects of that in college are not even looked at or regulated or even subjected to that same scrutiny in any way?
That's a great question. I guess if I'm being frank, it's not one. The fact that I am not heavily regulated, it doesn't keep me up at night, but maybe it should.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there is this tension. So what I would say is that there's one question about how well people can teach that haven't really been trained to teach. I think the other issue that I experience just in my day-to-day life is that how my incentives are aligned in terms of how I proportion my time in terms of research and teaching is, kind of nebulous, and that's a hard thing for me personally to kind of grapple with. So that's another issue that I think one has to think about here. And so I would say that any attempt to really fix, teaching in higher education would probably also have to deal with that. That may actually be you could do a lot just, I think, giving people, better tools. I certainly have improved as an educator, I think, and after hearing small things, not to say I'm not still improving or don't have a great way to go, but I know I've gotten better. It's a life
pursuit, yeah.
But I think that alongside the kind of craftsmanship of it, one becomes a better craftsman as you practice and learn. I think there's also just this problem of where the incentives are for professors. I mean, that's, I think, the big issue.
Yeah. And so specifically for you, you're at this, research university. So your incentives are very much leaning on the side of research and producing academic publications and things like that, right? Well, is that fair to say?
Yes, that is clearly of great importance to the people that end up evaluating those cases. But that's not to say that teaching isn't. I would say, part of the problem is just that it's not always clear, I think, to the people in my shoes that are trying to apportion their time correctly. Right. Undoubtedly research is important. I think teaching is absolutely important too. I do think it gets looked at. Right. But, how one should apportion their time is a puzzle that you're kind of left to your own devices to solve.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like if there is no measure looking at how well your students are leaving you, then there isn't this focus put on your output as a teacher specifically, even if you personally, care, or you hold yourself to a standard of trying to figure those things out and continue to improve. Yeah. It's not having that data to give you the focus makes it kind of tough, right? Sort of nebulous.
Well, and what we effectively do is just ask students to kind of self-assess their experiences in the class, and these things have terrific problems of bias. I mean, the research that I've seen suggests that female faculty members get much lower marks on these subjective ratings. This is a massive problem. Clearly, we could do better. I don't have a solution offhand, but I do think this is something that probably needs to be addressed.
Yeah, again, and that's probably something connected with the kind of legacy of not seeing, women as professors in the same way that men were. And it's like these historical layovers stick into society long after we've started to re-examine them or ask new questions. And so it's really hard to say. So that actually brings me to my next question, which was about just bias, right? So you just brought up this idea of bias within like rating a professor, for instance, right? Is there bias into standardized tests in general? Is that a pretty well-known thing that bias exists, or what is that? How does that play out as far as on your side in research?
So let me start with a concept that I think is important for people to understand, and then I'll tell you what we do to try to control for bias. Yeah. So there's a difference between bias and impact. So if I, just go around the U.S. and I measure every man and record all those measures. I'm just measuring height. I'm sorry. So I measure the height of every man, and I measure the height of every woman. And then I notice that men are taller on average than women. That is what we would call impact. That's just an observation that the two distributions are different in some way. Yeah. That is not to say that the measures of height are biased, right? Bias is a different question. Bias, the way that people think about bias, or the way I would suggest your listeners think about it, is if kind of, you hold constant something like ability. So you have two people who are equally good at math. Does their performance on an item that is meant to test math differ in some systematic way as a function of something about them that has nothing to do with math? So
for instance, language or cultural background.
Exactly. If I have a word problem that's, say I have a fifth grader and I'm asking a word problem that is really just meant to get at whether they can kind of add two numbers together. Right. And I have this elaborate paragraph with kind of very complex sentence construction. This is clearly going to be something that a student who's also learning English will struggle with greatly for no reason related to their math ability. Right. So that would be an example of an item that is potentially biased. Because of the language requirements able to or needed to access the problem. Exactly. Okay. In the argot of psychometrics, that is construct irrelevant variance. So we're seeing variance in the observed performance that has nothing to do with variance in the thing we care about, which in this case is math ability. Okay. Right. So I think that's an important thing to understand. So the reason I bring this up, oftentimes people look at measures, they may take something, they may take some standardized state accountability exam and say, poor kids are doing, 10 points worse on average than more affluent kids. Therefore, the test is biased. And that's, I think, just the wrong way to think about it. Okay. That to my way of thinking, that kind of thing is just evidence of the fact that poverty is typically challenging for people. And, for a whole variety, those kids maybe did not go to schools of the same quality, did not have maybe the same opportunities. This is not a statement about the kind of worth of the people that took the test or anything like that. It's potentially just a statement about measure of background knowledge and experience, maybe. Yeah, all of these things. Yeah. But that's not to say the test is biased in the technical sense that I think is important. So what is typically done with large-scale standardized tests is that items are first screened for bias in kind of I want to say superficial ways, but ways that just involve kind of content experts looking at the items and trying to determine whether or not these things are biased for reasons that are germane to the way that the measure is defined, the populations on which it'll be used, and those kinds of things. In California, this gets very complicated given the linguistic diversity of the student body, and but we do our best, doing these things kind of just looking at the items. And then what will happen downstream is we'll collect pilot data. And, for a given item, we'll say, okay, let's see how students perform on this item, holding their ability constant. So, maybe you'll take first boys and girls, and you'll say, for a boy that has a certain level of math ability, how do they do on this item on average compared to a girl of that same level of math ability? And what you want is those two things to be about the same.
Right.
If the item is working effectively, then all we should care about is your math ability. Nothing else that we know about you should tell us about your performance on that item.
So somebody from different genders or sex come in to do the problem, they would perform similarly. That would mean it wasn't necessarily biased towards gender or sex.
If they perform similarly, conditional in their math ability.
Okay, right. Yeah,
exactly.
Assuming a similar starting point in prior knowledge.
Exactly. And so, we'll screen items across a variety of dimensions. So gender is one dimension across which we'll screen items for bias. Race is typically another. Language status. Now, we have to think about, did you take this test online or on paper? And is that kind of leading to some systematic distortion of our understanding of your ability?
Yeah.
So that's, measures are certainly biased. Creating unbiased measures is just really hard, but I do think it's important for people to know the kinds of things that we do to try to at least minimize bias. It's not to say that you can't find an example of really bad items.
Sure.
Or that everything is perfect, but I think a good faith effort is made in most places to really understand and control for the kinds of bias that we can. And so if people are interested, the word that they might want to look for is differential item functioning.
Okay.
And so if you look in a technical report, say, for example, in the California State Assessment, you would find a ton of information about differential item functioning. And you would find that they talk about, we eliminated these items because they showed differential item functioning for these kinds of students.
Okay.
And the resulting measure is probably still not perfect, but there is at least an effort to remove items that show kind of clear signs of different performance across groups.
Okay. So if I was to try to just boil this down to a simple answer to your very nuanced answer, right? There's certainly no way to completely eliminate bias in the way questions are constructed. And at the same time, there's a lot of very deliberate effort to make sure that that's not something that's happening pervasively or regularly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is something that people are very worried about and do. We do what we can to get rid of it, but reality is complicated.
Now, I know this is a very hypothetical and you can't ever do this probably, but if you were to line up all the people writing items for all these tests, do you get the sense that this would be a well-rounded, culturally and linguistically diverse set of people making that?
The item writers. That's a fascinating question. I don't really know that I have the first sense. I've known some people that have written items. What I would say is this: item writers, the pool of item writers, that's typically just a kind of pool of professionals that have been employed through a variety of process. Like how you end up with that pool of item writers,
right? I
have no sense for whether that yields a representative sample. But what you typically also have is a kind of a pool of experts and stakeholders that will be involved in text construction. And that's where I think you would see a much more systematic approach to representativeness. So you'd have, educators, content experts, policymakers, parents. That's where I think you would get the kind of representative background and that group would be much more systematically representative of the people that are affected by the test than the item writing pool necessarily is. Right. That's an interesting question. I have no idea, but I'm curious now.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that too, because it's just this idea of, if black people are writing test items for black students, there's probably going to be a bias in the direction of favoring those students. And that's okay, maybe, as long as it's distributed across the entire pool of who's reading this test and writing this test.
There's more is known on that in terms of how observational protocols get used. So, we can't always ask people to take like a written test. So, for example, if you want to become a doctor, part of your certification process will involve you interacting with simulated patients. And that kind of thing involves, some human is just going to be rating your performance across a variety of different metrics. And those kinds of human ratings, where you have one human rating another, those are a lot has been learned about how you might see systematic bias as a function of similarities or dissimilarities between the rater and the ratee in those scenarios. Based on that, I'm sure that what you're saying is mostly right. I don't know of any good studies on that.
Yeah, I don't either. And anyway, okay, so we are just about out of time.
Okay.
And what I wanted to ask you about, I couldn't help but just getting like one or two quick myth dispelling questions on genetics.
Excellent. Okay.
Because I know you're into that, and I was really fascinated by looking into some of this stuff preparing for the interview. And we don't have time for much, so I really just want to
top hits.
Yeah, just let's dispel some of the top myths. Is there a difference in intelligence between races, or is there evidence of that?
Honestly, I think from a place of scientific integrity, I would have to say we just don't know.
Okay.
I don't have any strong reason to believe that there is. I think there's a great chapter in a recent book by Dalton Conley and Jason Fletcher that the book is called The Genome Factor, and they really go through in great detail what you would need to do and how hard it would be to design a study to answer that question. And so I think the honest answer is that we don't know, but this is not a question that I think, it does not concern me greatly. To me, any differences would be very marginal.
Yeah. So people out there who think that is a well-established fact, there is no evidence for that. No. There is no well-understood consensus anywhere in academia that says there's measurable differences in intelligence based on where you're from or what color your skin is.
No, I would say that things I study, both genes and test scores, they're good candidate mechanisms for understanding why people that start off in relatively similar situations end up different. They're, to me, terrible tools in general for understanding why people that start off in very different situations don't end up the same, right? And so I think that they offer information about human development and how we can kind of intervene with human development in important ways, but they are not, to me, candidate explanations for why people from dramatically different backgrounds aren't the same. Not at all.
So it sounds like what you're saying maybe is that the genetic factor in assessing people's potential is more about helping get the right supports to the right people based on their predisposed genetic profile.
For example, siblings, right? Siblings have, typically fairly similar kind of background environments, but different genetic endowments. And they have different kind of life courses that unfold in front of them. And it's, genes are one great way of understanding why they experience different life courses, because genes don't change and they're not a function of kind of the things that happen downstream. And so, I think if you have one child who does great in school, one child who does very poorly, right? These are siblings. It's unlikely, because parents didn't read to the kid, because parents probably read to both kids. But if you could show that, the kids have different genes, and in fact, the kid that had trouble reading had a bunch of genes that are predictive of dyslexia or poor eyesight, right? I could intervene way earlier,
right?
And it would teach me about like the downstream effects of, this genetic predisposition that one has. And so that's why I think genes could be relevant. I don't think genes are, in general, a great mechanism for understanding group differences.
Okay. And I think that's a great way for us to just dispel one of those big myths that I think float around a lot.
Yeah.
And I love how you put the focus on using it to support the needs of the student and understand where their trajectory may lead them versus trying to decide who's worthy of our time or not.
I want to maximize human flourishing. That's my only real goal, I think.
That is so beautiful. I think we'll leave it right there.
Excellent.
Professor Domingue coming into Modern Education today to talk about assessment, and I hope this was great for the audience. I know it was great for me, and I hope it was great for you as well.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right. And tune in each week, Friday at 3 to 4 o'clock on your commute for Modern Education.